It also has some dates still in the future, so maybe someday the batting average will be a non-zero number. ABHOTA is an acronym for A Brief History of the Apocalypse. Otherwise, pretty cryptic. C, philosophical and scientific issues. In the final few minutes of this solo part of the session, I want to shift away from details to a wider frame of reference, expressing what I think is wrong with the resurrection in more general terms. 1, the problematic nature of faith. Christians often say that certain claims, including revelations, should be accepted on pure faith. And there is biblical precedent. For example, in John 20:29, where Jesus says at the end of the Doubting Thomas episode, "Blessed are those who have not seen and believe." Just last Thursday, by sheer coincidence, I didn't plant this at all, this little letter appeared in the Austin paper. You may or may not read the Austin paper, but it has some entertainment value every now and then, from a letter writer who says that he accepts on pure faith the idea that the earth goes around the sun, and not the sun going around the earth. He says that because he himself wouldn't be able to figure this out just by looking. Now, this is a willfully perverse dismissal of about 500 years of increasingly precise evidence assembled by astronomers and physicists, and to me it implies either spectacular ignorance and intellectual laziness, or a desire to reject modern science. And it won't surprise you to hear that he favors creationism, a pseudoscience if ever there was one. This is the equivalent of wanting to believe that Jesus really did go to India in spite of what the scholars say. And it's an excellent example of how bad it is to deny the value of evidence. One of the most forceful statements against such pure faith was made by an almost forgotten British mathematical genius, W.K. Clifford, who died in 1879 at the distressingly young age, from my perspective, of 34. Some of Clifford's work done at the age of 25 paved the way for Einstein's general theory of relativity, by the way. The quote, item 18, is where it comes from, is, "It is wrong, always, everywhere, and for anyone to believe anything upon insufficient evidence." Sounds like a condensed expression of 19th century confidence in scientific progress. Almost a century later, the British philosopher Richard Robinson published in 1964 a series of undergraduate lectures to people like you, but at Oxford University, with the very striking title, "An Atheist's Values," item 19. The whole book has been posted, probably illegally, on a webpage. Nowhere near 70 years from the death of the author. Robinson has several trenchant pages on the inadequate definitions of faith in Paul, Aquinas, and Cardinal Newman. It concludes, echoing Clifford at the end, quoting, "No wonder that there is no true and intelligible account of faith in Christian literature. What they mean is too shocking to survive exposure. Faith is a great vice, something irrational and undesirable, a form of self-hypnotism. It follows that far from its being wicked to undermine faith, it is a duty to do so. We ought to do what we can towards eradicating the evil habit of believing without regard to evidence." End of quote. Pretty strong stuff for undergraduates in the 50s, even at the most intellectual university in the English-speaking world. Parts 1 and 3 of Robinson's book, free online, are slow going, but part 2 is extraordinary for its quiet but unsparing rejection of some of the core values of the New Testament. And I wouldn't be a good outside agitator and troublemaker, which is my role here today, if I didn't mention the most philosophically sophisticated attempt at disproving the existence of God, which is Michael Martin's Atheism, number 20, one of the most difficult, intellectually speaking, books you will ever try to read. Section 2, myopias. Myopias that make it difficult for many people to process the evidence flooding in from the empirical sciences and acquire a new sense of proportion that corresponds to the realities now being uncovered. First myopia, astronomical. When my parents were born, that was the same age, there was, just a century ago, there was one galaxy called the Milky Way. It was only around 1925 that Edwin Hubble identified Cepheid variables in the Andromeda Nebula, as it was called then, which meant they were stars. And the nebula wasn't some little cloud inside our galaxy, it was its own galaxy, and at therefore truly staggering distances. And it isn't the only one. Astronomers now say, you're probably familiar with the figure, that there are 100 billion galaxies out there with about 100 billion stars each. typically 100,000 light years in diameter. That's 100,000 times 6 trillion, which is 600 quadrillion miles in diameter. And in spite of that, the farthest away ones look like this in a telescope. That's how far off they are. People speak of three great revolutions in thought, Copernican, Darwinian, Freudian, each successively dethroning Earth, humans, and our conscious egos from their formerly central positions in the universe. But the Copernican shift only moved the center of planetary orbits to the sun. The 20th century expansion to a universe now estimated at 10 to the 21st miles, that's 1 followed by 21 zeros, in every direction, originating in a Big Bang 13.8 billion years ago, is a much harder concept for our little human minds to grasp. There are philosopher-theologians who try to reconcile these new facts with old-time notions, telling us about fine-tuning, or the anthropic universe, a universe designed from the start so that we humans could arise in it. But to me, this just seems very bizarrely self-centered. The 17th century French philosopher Blaise Pascal once wrote, "The silence of infinite spaces terrifies me." Even today, space isn't quite infinite in a literal sense, but its scale, its emptiness, its indifference can be a pretty frightening revelation. We've come a long way from Earth being the biggest of all things and at the center of the universe with a benign God just up there, except if you're Australian, it's that way apparently. But other than that, theologians sometimes say, trying to respond to this, that God is outside the space-time continuum. This is a 20th century view. But if God does want to enter into our dimensions and come down to Earth, how does he find the right galaxy and the right star? Major problem in map making. That too is a rhetorical question. Second myopia, chronological. I just mentioned the Big Bang, which is now so familiar, it has its own TV show. This is really great. That involves a time scale that is about as incomprehensible as the size of the universe, and very far from the smallness of the biblical literalists who still do endorse Bishop Ussher's date of October 23rd, 4004 BC as the creation. With apologies for lowering the tone of this discussion, I want to call out the cheesiest prop you will ever see in a college classroom, which is this. And this, I think, is the appropriate end of it. You recognize these from your youth as alphabet blocks. Imagine that each one is 1,000 years. Right? 3 of them, right here, will suffice to get you to the point at which, going backwards in time, the Hebrews became monotheists. The general view nowadays is that they didn't begin as monotheists, they were ordinary polytheists, and through a revolution became monotheists about 3,000 years ago. If we go back to the origins of agriculture and urban civilization, we will need to get back to about this far, maybe 9 or 10,000 years ago. If we want to go back to the migration of AMHS, anatomically modern Homo sapiens, out of East Central Africa, that would be about 70 blocks, and that was too cheap. And I don't have arms long enough to reach 70 blocks. That would be about 9 feet. To reach the origin of our species, about 200 blocks, 200,000 years, 7 to 25 feet. On the same scale, the separation of hominids from the other primates, estimated at 6 to 7 million years ago, at 8 blocks per foot, would be over 800 feet. The dawn of life, 3.8 billion years ago, 3.8 million blocks, would be about 90 miles, 2/3 of the way to Houston. I think it's that direction, right? East. The Big Bang that we just talked about with its own TV show, 13.8 billion years, that's the current figure, I heard it from Stephen Weinberg last fall, would take us about 330 miles, which means Lake Charles, Louisiana. On the same scale in which the whole of recorded human history from cuneiform and hieroglyphic in Mesopotamia and Egypt is this. 6 blocks, about 3,000 years ago, is the origins of writing. Now I've gotten a second use on the blocks, so I can retire them. It takes monumental egotism as individuals and as a species to say that all of that previous time from here to Lake Charles was merely preparation waiting for the unique and wonderful species that we are to come into existence. Third and final myopia, anthropological. As already noted, our species came into existence about 200,000 years ago, began its migration out of East Central Africa about 70,000. This is genetic drift information. Those are comfortably small numbers compared with millions and billions but they're still far larger than the literalist chronology that compresses human history into 6,000 years. I think there is something inherently wrong with the idea that none of our remote ancestors or the other humans and hominids in prehistory scattered all over the planet by 3,000 years ago mattered at all until one tiny tribe, known as the Hebrews, was chosen by the only divine being that matters out of thousands of major and minor gods in world mythology. And who tells us this anyway? Why, the Hebrews themselves. What better source could we possibly ask? The long-range view of human prehistory will come up again in 2 minutes. I'll be finished very shortly. Finally, the crucifixion and resurrection are routinely explained as necessary for the salvation of mankind. This is 3 arguments against the soul. Although it's been 2,000 years and 5/7 of humanity hasn't been converted or saved yet. But that claim assumes that each person has a soul or personhood that can survive death and perhaps achieve immortality. Obviously, people have debated that idea for centuries. My comments today reflect one recent development in modern philosophy, a revival of interest in an ancient argument form fancily known as the Sorites paradox. It sounds like a disease, but it's not. Or the problem of the heap, known as vagueness in other circles and linked to the computer category called fuzzy logic. I should add that the Greek word for heap was soros, so sorites means simply the heap argument or the heap problem. Invented in the 300s BCE by the obscure philosopher named Eubulides, put his name up on the board, if you've never seen it before, you'll never see it again, I think. One of the most interesting characters around. He also invented the liar paradox. I am lying. Is that true or false? If it's true, it's false. If it's false, it's true. Sentence on the other side of this card is false. That is considered a 10 on a 10 scale of difficulty of paradoxes by Mark Sainsbury, philosopher at UT, fellow of the British Academy, just published a book on paradoxes a few years ago. Well, the Sorites paradox, also invented by Eubulides, starts by imagining a pile of sand, a big one. This is a prop I didn't want to bring because it could be a dump truck into the classroom. So it would be very tedious and messy. But imagine there's a great big pile of sand here. Suppose I take away 1 grain. Is it still a pile? If I take away another, and another, and if I keep on doing it for the next 30 years, what happens? You work your way down to 3, 2, 1, 0, and there was never a magic grain of sand where everyone would agree, here it was a pile at n, and here is n minus 1 is not a pile. So there's a very puzzling paradox here. You apply the word, and you say, yes, it's a pile, but you can't tell me when it stops being a pile. And this has come back roaring to life in the last 20 years in philosophy. There are 400 papers, books, and articles on the keyword vagueness at the Philosopher's Index, which is their online bibliography, just in the last 20 years or so. Well, who cares about sand piles? But this simple little question has had ripple effects in a lot of areas of thought. 3 professional philosophers and your speaker, I'm sorry to say, items 21 to 23, have used the Sorites paradox argument to address issues about souls and personhood. Lee Kirchhoff and Sarah Waller, the first, showed that the concept personhood falls victim to the Sorites paradox, meaning that there is no definable threshold that marks the transition from person to from non-person to person. People say that there is a moment of conception. This is a 19th century, largely a 19th century convention. But embryologists will tell you that's simply not true. There's no sudden magic moment in which the fertilized egg takes on a new status, because it takes a while for an egg to get fertilized. It takes even longer for it to get implanted. And embryologists will also tell you that if you set personhood that early at the moment of fertilization of an egg, 50 to 80% of fertilized eggs die before implanting. So that would be a lot of wasted souls flitting around the universe. That's the embryological Sorites. Ted Sider, number 22, makes an even more powerful